So hello, everybody. Welcome. It's really wonderful to see you on one of the first super cold nights of the year. I think we hit the 20s this morning, and this evening we're in the low 30s. But what better to warm our hearts than the story of Betty Friedan? We're so lucky to have author Rachel Shteir here. I didn't check to make sure I'm saying it right. Yes, okay, good. Who wrote the book? Betty Friedan, Magnificent Disruptor. I want to tell you just a little bit about our author. Rachel Shteir is an award-winning writer whose work has appeared in national magazines and newspapers, including the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal. She's the author of 3 previous books. The Striptease, The Untold History of the Girly Show, Gypsy, The Art of the Tease, and The Steal, A Cultural History of Shoplifting. She's also the founder and current head of the Dramaturgy and Dramatic Criticism program at the Theater School at DePaul University. She holds a DFA in Dramaturgy and Dramatic Criticism from the Yale School of Drama and a BA in Near Eastern Languages and Literatures from the University of Chicago. We are thrilled to welcome you here to Port Jewish Center to hear about your book. And I'm just going to turn things right over to you. So without further ado, Rachel Shteir.
Thank you so much for that introduction, and thank you everybody for coming here to this space to hear me talk about my book. Excuse me, I'm going to talk for about 35 or 40 minutes, maybe max. And then I would love to hear your questions and comments and dialogue. There's always a lot to say about Betty, way more than I can ever get into a 35 or 40-minute talk, but I'm gonna really try hard to hit all the high points and the low points and the important points. So let me start with a little bit of background, just how I came to write this book. This is the first biography of Betty Friedan to appear in over 20 years. Who was Betty Friedan? Some of you may know Betty Friedan was the founder of second wave feminism. Her dates are 1921 to 2006. Her biggest accomplishments are probably the writing of the Feminine Mystique, which some of you may have read, which was published in 1963 and changed women's lives. That was a phrase that women would come up to Betty. I'm going to call her Betty because I worked on this book for 6 years, and so I feel very intimate with her. Betty, women would come up to her and they would say, "You changed my life," right? Because the Feminine Mystique was a book that when women read it, they realized that they were not alone in what they were feeling, in what they had felt in the late 1950s and the early 60s. The argument of the Feminine Mystique, if you read it a long time ago, is just that women should have more in their in their lives than just their husband and their children. It wasn't an anti-family book in any way, but it was saying women should live up to their fullest potential. They should be human beings. They should have equality. The Feminine Mystique did not it did not provide any kind of grandiose solution to this inequality. It just presented the problem of the Feminine Mystique. It laid it out in each different realm, or in many different realms of society, how the Feminine Mystique is affecting women. For example, in terms of psychology and Freud, and then in terms of higher education, and in terms of what were some other things? Alfred Kinsey, and in terms of the social sciences, and so on and so on. Oh, Madison Avenue and advertising was another realm. Okay, but so I'm telling you this because I want you to know that one of the important things about Betty is the Feminine Mystique, which is a book that people keep coming back to, although it's sometimes to argue with the book and it's sometimes to say that the book is terrible, but it's a kind of touchstone for where we have been as women and feminists. Okay, so that's one thing, one of Betty's accomplishments, major accomplishments that you need to know about. The other one is probably the founding of the National Organization for Women, which happened 3 years after the writing of the Feminine Mystique. Betty was, depending on who you ask, she was a co-founder or the founder. Okay, there are different opinions about this, but one thing that's certain is that Betty's drive and her galvanizing force created this movement. As many of you probably also know, the National Organization for Women is still around today. It's the I believe it's certain, I know it's one of the few women's organizations from that era to still be around, which is amazing. A lot, and it's also a very centrist organization. It's not anti-men, it's not anti-family, and that's an interesting thing to think about. So those two accomplishments, the founding of NOW, and NOW changed many laws. Betty was president of NOW for the first 4 years from 1966 to 1970. She changed many laws. She started many chapters of NOW. She went all across the country and, galvanized women to join NOW. She moved NOW from being a grassroots organization to being a major powerhouse that was able to change legislation. Those two accomplishments. Okay, but I started this whole story of telling you what Betty's major accomplishments were because I wanted to tell you a little bit about how I came to write this book. So it was 10 years ago. It was 2013. And at the time, that was the 50th anniversary of the Feminine Mystique. And I got an assignment from a magazine to write about the Feminine Mystique and to write about some other books that were more recent books by women, including Sheryl Sandberg's Lean In, which was published in 2013. And the goal of this assignment was to write about how the Feminine Mystique was in dialogue with these other books. And at that time, I had never read the Feminine Mystique. Okay. So I started to read the Feminine Mystique and I was blown away by its force. The Feminine Mystique is a lot of different things. There's a lot of different things to say about it. But one thing is it's very persuasively written. It's very powerfully written. It's a polemic, but it's also very personal. Betty indicts herself as being complicit in the Feminine Mystique, and that makes for very affecting reading. So I was reading the Feminine Mystique, and then I was reading these other books, and the other books were not so strong, and also they took some of Betty's arguments, but they didn't really mention Betty. And so I was very interested in that, how could that be? And so that was the piece that I wrote for this magazine about how 50 years after the Feminine Mystique has been written, it's kind of silent. It's kind of been silenced. And what does that mean? And the piece, people liked the piece a lot. And eventually I was asked to write this biography of Betty. So, okay, so that's the story of how the book came to be. And I sold it in, it was around 2016. So as I said, I've been working on it ever since, until 2022 around. So let me go backwards then from telling you about Betty's two major accomplishments. Let me just give you the arc of her life, the big arc of her life, so that you can understand more fully Betty in context. So Betty, as I said, she was born in 1921 in Peoria, Illinois, which is about 3 hours south by car of Chicago. So she was a Midwesterner, in other words, and she also was from a small town. And she grew up in a Reform family, but she also grew up in a town where there were not that many Jews. And when she was a child, this was growing up in the, well, first of all, the women had just gotten the vote right before she was born. So there's that. And her mother was a very accomplished person, although she was a housewife. Um, but when Betty was growing up in the 30s during the Depression, there was a rise in anti-Semitism. And Betty's family felt that they were discriminated against. And Betty herself was discriminated against when she was a child and a young person. And that stayed with her. But she would not really talk about that until much, much later, really until the 1970s. She, as a young person growing up in Peoria, Illinois, she rejected what she felt was her mother's idea of what Jewishness was, which was a concern with services and a concern with assimilating. Betty, her mother was very beautiful and was very put together and was very, she had like a very, I don't know, a very social manner, right? She was a very good, I don't know, she volunteered many places, and she did many good acts, right? But Betty as a child rebelled against all of this. She had a fiery temper even as a child, which I take to be a kind of rebellion against her mother and against what her mother stood for. And so Betty, one of the things about Betty that it's important to know is that Miriam, Betty's mother, had wanted to go to Smith College, but her father, Miriam's father, Sander Horowitz, who came to America from Europe in the 1880s, he did not want his daughter to go to college, and certainly not to Smith College. So Miriam became a housewife. She married Harry Goldstein, who was a jeweler, and then they had Betty and two other children, Harry and Amy. But Miriam was never happy being a housewife, and that really made an impression on Betty when she was growing up. And Betty also went to Smith College, which her mother had wanted to go to. So in a sense, she was living the life her mother had always wanted to live. So Betty went to Smith. There too, she experienced anti-Semitism, but she also, at Smith, she found a place for herself, which she had not found in Peoria. She was an incredibly brainy child, and her parents were very worried about her. They were worried that she would never find any place in life. Oh no, help! Are you there? Okay. They were worried that she would never find her place in life. So when she went to Smith, she excelled. She won all the prizes. She began to run the school newspaper, and she just generally really found herself. She would later say about that time that it made her feel like she was not a freak, which she had felt growing up in Peoria. And then after Smith, she majored in psychology, and after Smith, she went to Berkeley for 1 year to go to grad school in psychology, where she studied with many amazing people like Erik Erikson and others. But in the middle of the first year, she decided she could not do it anymore. She did not want to be a scholar. She did not want to do psychology in the academy, and she dropped out, and she moved to New York, and she became a journalist for left-wing newspapers. And she wrote for left-wing newspapers. She wrote about all different subjects, including anti-Semitism, but also Jim Crow laws, also sexism. She wrote these kind of comic pieces, which were, kind of like detective novel type of pieces. And she worked at that newspaper for a couple of years, and then she got married and she began a family. She did not want to stop working. She did not want to be her mother. She did not want to fall into the trap that her mother had fallen into. So she continued to write, but as she kept having children, she also had 3 children, like her mother. And eventually they moved outside of New York City to Rockland County, to Grandview on Hudson, near what used to be called the Tappan Zee Bridge. I understand it's now called the Mario Cuomo Bridge, but it used to be the Tappan Zee Bridge. Betty was raising this family, and she was trying to keep her journalism career alive. She had stopped writing for left-wing magazines, and she now was writing for women's magazines like Ladies' Home Journal, Good Housekeeping, and all of that. And it was difficult for her. And then came a time in 1957 when she attended her 15-year reunion at Smith. And what she realized was that very few women were still working. They had all receded, as she put it, into the family. They had kind of disappeared from they had stopped trying to make their mark on the world. And this upset her. And she started to try and write an article about it, but she couldn't find a place for this article. Editors kept rejecting it. But Betty was very stubborn, so she kept sending it out. And it was called, the title of the article was, "Are Women Wasting Their Time in College?" And that was the beginning of the feminine mystique. What Betty did was she created a survey, a kind of sociological survey, and she sent it out to all of the women in her cohort at Smith, who were class of 43, who were then in 57, or 42, in 57, having their 15-year reunion. And the survey had questions on it like, are you happy in your marriage, blah 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 blah. So she got the results of these survey, and she kept working on this article, and she kept sending it out, and eventually she sold the book to W.W. Norton. Okay, and she worked on the book for 5 years, and in 1963 the Feminine Mystique was published. Okay, and what happened then? What happened then was Betty became a celebrity. The book was an instant hit. It was very successful. As I said, women came up to her. They had not imagined that other women felt the same kind of loneliness and depression that they felt. And they were grateful for it. There were also criticisms of the book right from the beginning. One criticism was that the book did not include Black women, and it did not include working class women. And Betty answered that critique the way she answered a lot of things, which was she started a second book, which was about women after the Feminine Mystique, and it dealt with women who were in the work world, and it was much broader, but that book never got published. And the reason it never got published is because the Civil Rights Act was passed in 1964, and Betty was very impatient, like other women of that era. Many other women, she was impatient, and she asked herself, well, why can't we have a Civil Rights Act for women? Why can't that be passed? And so she began to think that just writing a book and publishing a book was not enough to change laws, which is what was needed, which she felt it had to start with laws. So that is how she came to start now in the summer of 1966, in June of 1966, was because she felt that she abandoned the second book project. And Now was an extraordinary organization. One of the goals of Now from the very beginning was to get women from all different walks of life into a room together and talk. That was it. It was like somebody mentioned consciousness raising early on. It was like that. Another thing about the National Organization for Women, Betty always emphasized that it had this word for. It was not of, right? The organization was for women. That was very important to her. It was not anti-men. She wanted to include men in the movement. They started off right away, and they started to change laws. Some of the laws they changed early on were, for example, laws that allowed discrimination in help wanted ads. That was a big thing early on. Another had to do with stewardesses and age limits that stewardesses had to abide by, and weight limits. They changed that law. So now it was very active, and it was affecting all different realms of society, and it was amazing. But what happened was with Betty was that it's very different to be the writer of a book, even if it's a best-selling book, and to be the leader of a national organization that's, designed, you're meeting with people all the time, and you have to strategize, and you have to be a diplomat, and you have to be a politician, etc. Betty was asked to be the first president of NOW. And at first she didn't want to. And the reason she didn't want to was she knew that she didn't have the character for it, the temperament. She said, I have a writer's temperament, right? What does that mean? A writer's temperament, i.e. somebody who sits in their room and is, kind of involved in thinking. That's very different than this kind of person who needs to lead the movement. So when Betty began to lead the movement, the things that had kind of been submerged about her character began to come out. And although she accomplished many, many things in her 4 years at NOW, and then afterward, there were other things that happened in the early years of NOW, those first 4 years, that also, what do I want to say? They speak to how Betty's idea of what the women's movement was very different from especially younger women who were coming into NOW. What do I mean by that? Okay, in 1968 and 69, women's liberation began to be very big. And what was women's liberation? Women's liberation was like anti-men, really much more involved in what Betty called sexual politics. For example, lesbians who had been in the closet, they wanted to come out, and they wanted that to be part of the National Organization for Women. Betty did not want that, and she was very clear about it. And sometimes she was very clear in what I think to our minds today, or to our ears today, sounds cruel. For example, she used the phrase lavender menace to refer to these lesbians, and that stuck with her. People remembered that. What else can I tell you about Betty? Well, so she left NOW. She stepped down from the presidency in 1970. However, after that, she continued to fight for women's rights. She didn't stop just because she stepped down from the presidency. She accomplished many things. One was the women's strike for equality in the summer of 1970. That was an amazing event where women from all over the country marched down the main streets of their towns and down Fifth Avenue in Manhattan, for example. And this was meant to be a show of solidarity, and it was, and it really moved NOW to a different level. Betty also continued to start organizations. For example, she started the National Women's Political Caucus in 1971. That was an organization that was dedicated to getting women into politics. That was it, because Betty felt that NOW was not doing that enough. She started a women's bank. She fought for the Equal Rights Amendment in the 70s until, the early 80s, when the Equal Rights Amendment did not ratify. And she continued to fight for the women's movement throughout the 80s and 90s. But during that time, the later decades of her life, she felt that the women's movement had stalled, and she was very unsettled by that. Oh, I want to mention one other thing. So just to thread the needle a little bit on the subject of her Jewishness, in the mid-70s, she began to talk about her Jewishness and about the connection between her Jewishness and especially the anti-Semitism that she had endured in Peoria, Illinois, and her fighting for equality. And she talked about how she had seen herself as an outsider, and how that helped her fight for women. During this time, she also made several trips to Israel. On one of those trips, she helped Israeli women start the first Israeli feminist group, independent Israeli feminist group. She also, she was very much a champion of women rabbis. She got behind women rabbis. She worked briefly for American Jewish Congress. What I would say about this time is that just as she had fought with lesbians in the early 70s, she also fought with rabbis in the late 70s and early 80s. I mean, she was a fighter. I think of Betty as someone who threw the first punch, and she had to do that, she had to do certain things. When I think of my book and what I was trying to accomplish in my book, it was really, and it is really, because I'm still very much in conversation with it. It's really about women, and it's really investigating the idea of, can women, like, in order to start something with the ambition that Betty had, is it possible to do that and also be liked? Betty was not afraid to be disliked. In fact, sometimes it seems when you read about her that she's actively trying to be disliked. And it's a very interesting thing to think about. I also, while writing this book, I thought a lot about whether there's a double standard for male leaders and female leaders. For example, reading about Betty in the media, as she was covered in the media in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, with these kind of very sarcastic descriptions of her clothes and what she looked like. You had to be a really tough-minded person to be able to press forward, I think. So, as I said, she continued to work for women's rights even after the devastating blow to the Equal Rights Amendment. And at the end of her life, she advised young women to take risks, and she was very concerned about her legacy and very concerned about the women's movement and where it was going and what had happened and whether there were going to be setbacks. And she continued to think about this and give talks really almost up to her death. She did not want to stop. So maybe that's where I'll pause. And I mean, I would love to take questions or hear your thoughts.
Thank you so much. I'm sure there are questions or comments. Marcia and Mark, I'm going to call on you first. I saw Marcia, you're already going for the button. So why don't you start?
Yeah. Well, I've got about 6 questions, but I'll ask one. In her personal life, did her marriage last? What happened with her kids? Were they all supportive of what she was doing, or
Yeah. Those are great questions. I mean, so okay, I'll take her marriage first. So, one of the, I don't know, tragedies I think about Betty is she did not have a good marriage. She married someone who, I don't know, he was just, he was threatened, I guess is what I want to say. Like, once she became successful, he was very threatened by her. But even before that, their marriage was very tumultuous and even violent. And one of the things, and so they got divorced this was Carl Friedan, his name was. They got divorced in 1971, I think, 1971. So a year after Betty stepped down from the presidency of now. But I think one of the things that I always think about when people are talking about, her temper and so on when she was leading now, is that she was fighting with Carl. And also she was really worried that people would find out that she did not have a good marriage and that would discredit the movement. She was very worried, and maybe that seems like a silly thing, but it was very serious back then, right? If people would say about her, oh, she's just a feminist because she has a bad marriage. The whole feminist, that was what, so she was very worried about it. So she kept it all hidden. Her friends knew, but she kept it very hidden. And it was not until later that it really came out, how bad the marriage had been and how violent. It was violent on both ends, by the way. It was not, Carl did hit Betty, which is terrible, but Betty hit back also. So it was really fisticuffs. Okay, her children, that's another interesting thing. So her sons Daniel and Jonathan were born in the 40s, the late, like 47 and 48. And so by the time that the Feminine Mystique came out in 63, and so they definitely endured, some of the tumult in the marriage. And also, Betty was a kind of, she could be kind of inattentive as a parent, right? But by the time the Feminine Mystique came out, they were, like at the end of their high school career or going to college. They were in college already. Like Daniel went to Princeton, and Jonathan, I think, went to Columbia, although he dropped out. And Jonathan has a very interesting life story. He dropped out and went and lived on the West Coast and was a fisherman for a while. But the child that really, I think, got the most dramatic effect of Betty's, complex parenting and the marriage and everything was Emily, the youngest child, and the girl who was born in 1956, because Emily was still in the house when Betty, they moved back to New York in 1963. They moved into the Dakota. So they had been living up in the suburbs, right? And then all of a sudden they moved into the Dakota and they started living this other life. And Betty was very in demand. She was traveling all the time. And it was rough on Emily, I think. I think, one of the reasons I also wanted to write this biography is because in some of the previous biographies, whenever people talked about Betty as a mother to her children, they would always say, oh, she was a bad mother. And I tried to draw a different picture. It's not that her children also joke about this, so it's not a secret or anything. Like, she would give them TV dinners. She would send them to school in a taxi. She would not open the door. Like, if she was writing, when she was writing the Feminine Mystique and they would knock on the door, she would not answer. Right. So, I mean, that's what I mean when I say there's a certain kind of inattentiveness. But I also think at the same time, when there were certain things that both she and Carl were really committed to as parents, like namely making sure that their children were curious and like intellectually alive and questioners. And they would do things like they would go out in the backyard and stay out all night and like watch Sputnik, as a family. So I guess I want to say, I think that the picture, in the previous biographies, when I was reading them to prepare for writing this book, I often felt like she was getting tarred with the brush of, oh, you're a bad mother because you were a career woman. And I think that's too simple. Yes, it's true that there were certain things she didn't do that you would think, oh, that seems okay, a little bit much, but at the same time, I mean, she just rejected things like cleaning. She wasn't cooking a lot of it. She didn't do those things. I think partly in reaction to her own mother, who was a very accomplished host, although her mother had a cook, right? So, okay, so that's a long answer to your questions.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Who has the next question? Or Marcia, do you want to ask the follow-up? And then if you have a question, can you just let me know in the chat or by raising your hand? Yeah, I can.
I can ask one of my other questions.
Great.
You addressed her attitude toward lesbians wanting to be part of the feminist movement. What was her relationship with Black women, or her attitude toward their participation?
Yes,
in the
yes.
70s?
Well, again, complex. So the you know, in the 40s, before Betty even wrote the Feminine Mystique, she definitely wrote a number of pieces that were against Jim Crow laws and so on and so on, right? So she was definitely active. She was against segregation, and she marched with King. She tried to get Coretta to join Now. She had a number of there were a number of other Black women who were very interested in Now and who had read the Feminine Mystique, and Pauli Murray, who was the first Black woman to go to Harvard Law School, was another one of the founders of Now, and she and Betty collaborated on a number of projects, and they were friends. So I think it's a mistake to say that, some people sometimes criticize Now and say that it was just white, or that this and that. And, anyone who's still alive from Now in that period will say, yes, we made mistakes. We were just trying to do it or whatever. But I also think it wasn't just white. It did try to involve women of different backgrounds. But where Betty drew the line was Black Power. The Black Power movement, which was formed or began to be created in the late 60s, and was really more about radicalism and I guess I would say anti-white sentiment, right? It was not Martin Luther King's message. And Betty, she just was unequivocal about this, just as she was Betty was not anti-lesbian. I want to make that clear. What she didn't like was anything that she felt would diminish the idea of just women altogether. Women. What she wanted to do was create a space for women. She didn't want to have identities of race or people's, what she'd call the bedroom practices or whatever. She didn't want those to be the central issues of the women's movement. Why? Because she worried that if they were the central issues, that the what she considered the core issues would be completely ignored. Those core issues were like reproductive rights, equal pay, equal political representation, childcare, right? And she worried that like people's sexual identity would just dominate, right? And I think there's one way that you can say, well, that's what happened. So Black Power, when Black Power started to become a kind of rise, Betty was just she was unequivocal about this. She didn't think that there was a place for it in the women's movement.
I wonder what she would have thought of intersectionality.
No, she wouldn't have liked it. I mean,
Yeah.
I think that was her point, was really there isn't a space to talk about women. Right. She certainly tried to bring women of different backgrounds into the space, but she felt that once these other things also began to be talked about, women got lost. The concerns of women got lost. That's her idea. And intersectionality is kind of the opposite of that idea, right? Yeah.
Arguably, intersectionality was the death of the Women's March. And, she had a point, right? She had a really good point.
She had a good point. She had a good point, because you could argue that we've made a lot of strides in identity. right? Identity politics, like people can certainly live in much more diverse ways than they could in the late 50s and early 60s, like including women, gay people, lesbians. They can live, the ways that you can live are much more varied. But what about the core women's issues that Betty and now are fighting for, namely childcare, political representation and representation in business, reproductive rights, and equal pay? Like I personally feel that, I mean, I'm partisan, obviously, but I think that, again, those issues are not sexy, right? Those are just basic issues, you know, that have sort of been, you could argue they've been neglected, or that we've slid backwards on those issues, you know. Oh, somebody has their hand up.
Yeah, I see, Roberta. I just want to say it's very, and Roberta, I'm calling on you, so unmute yourself. So, but I just want to say it's interesting to think about that, because I think that, you know, it's, you know, when you talk about her being a fighter, and you talk about, you know, kind of what, you know, how angry she made people, but she was right, and you know, and it's an interesting.
Yeah, and part of it was her manner, and part of it was the way she looked. I mean, she would do things that, you know, just now would be unthinkable. Like, for example, she would tell senators, you know, if you don't vote X way, I'm gonna hunt you down in your vacation home. You know, like, who talks like that? Like, nobody talks like that. You know, she just would really get up in people's faces and really, you know, and I think sometimes it alienated people and it backfired, you know, and I think other times it worked for her strategically. Yeah.
Roberta.
Yeah, a couple of things. I want to piggyback on what Marcia said for a second. For the children, especially Emily. First, did you have an opportunity to interview them firsthand, or basically you got, all three of them?
Yeah.
Okay.
Multiple times.
Okay, so we have what her sons did or are doing. What about the daughter?
They're all very successful children, and they all have their own families who are all very successful. Emily is a pediatrician. Daniel was an MacArthur Genius Grant physicist, and Jonathan is a architect and engineer.
So he went back to school. He stopped fishing.
He did. He eventually went back, you know, he took a kind of 60s journey, and then he went back to school. And you know, he's very successful. They're all very successful, and they all have their own children, their own families.
So it doesn't appear that Emily rebelled against her mom in a way.
No, she did rebel. She did rebel initially. I mean, initially, you know, there's famous stories like when Emily went to college around that time, where she's quoted as saying, "I am not a feminist," you know, on national television. For example, there's like a Barbara Walters interview with Betty and Emily where you know, Barbara asks Emily, "Well, so what was it like to be the daughter of, you know, Betty Friedan?" She said, "I am not a feminist." But later she retracted, and you know, she's, you know, when she got up into her mid-20s and she went to medical school, you know, I mean, I think there's something about how, you know, daughters not wanting to be their mothers, right? And it's, you know, and I think Emily felt that very profoundly, very keenly. But later, I think she also came to, as they all did, she came to appreciate her mom and really value what she had given the world. I mean, I think Emily would say, in fact, she did say, you know, can you really give the world what Betty gave the world, and also give your children exactly what they need at the exact time that they need it, right?
I would say that if she rebelled, if you told me she's a stay-at-home mom, did not have a career, and was her grandma.
Right.
And
I
she
see.
was, and she didn't. So I think you're right. She came to terms with it's hard to be both a successful, you can't be in two places at the same time.
You
And
can't.
you can't. And you hear every woman that works
Every
feels that
woman. Yeah.
tug. Everyone, no matter what your job is.
Right.
So you're always making, so she didn't, in my opinion. Rebelling
Right.
would be, he didn't
Right.
work.
Right.
And the
Yeah.
other thing, I didn't have an opportunity to read your book yet.
Mhm.
But I felt that, you know, I was of the generation of Betty Friedan. I didn't realize the book was 63. I
Mhm.
thought it would be later than that
Mm.
because I went to college like from 70 to 74. And I
Mhm.
always thought that that was the woman. So it was Gloria Steinem, Betty Friedan. I did read the Feminine Mystique. It was Bella Absoc. It was all those women fighting for the same thing. And
Yep.
I thought that the impetus of that, and I could be wrong, I don't, you know, was first of all, my mom was a very good role model, but you know, she initially was that stay-at-home mom that kind of rejected it and later on did her thing and couldn't be as attentive. So I had many a TV dinner and many of get yourself ready to school. You know, she was doing her own thing. But I thought the impetus was that like in the 50s, you had these women that didn't have careers, and then divorce was not common years ago. And then divorce came, and these women had nothing.
Mhm.
And I thought that was what initiated the feminist movement. That's what I thought. I don't know why. I was in
Huh.
high school, college, and that the goal was you better learn to stand on your own 2 feet.
Mm.
Because at any point in time, whereas divorce, like I didn't have any friends that had divorced parents.
Right.
And then all of a sudden, like in the 70s, you read articles or you heard of people, they were married for 25 years, the kids went off, the men, you got divorced, and the women had no income of their own, no way to support themselves in their own right. Now,
Right.
I don't know where I got that from, but
Well,
that's,
yeah, no. I mean, you know, divorce laws changed during this time, right? And so, right, no fault divorce, right? That allowed men to not pay alimony, and this was a somewhat divisive issue
right.
in the women's movement. But Gloria, Bella Abzug was more Betty's age, right? They were contemporaries, and Gloria, of course, was also a contemporary, but Gloria was 12 years younger than Betty. So, you know, not like a daughter, but really a younger sister. And
Does your
they,
book touch on those relationships? Do
yeah,
you talk about
yeah.
it in the book? Oh, you
Yeah,
do? Okay.
yeah. I mean, Gloria and Betty had a rivalry, and they didn't really speak after 1971. You know, and again, the rivalry, the roots of the rivalry are very complex. You know, but Gloria, I think in some ways Gloria became more associated with the women's movement than Betty. I think when people hear the phrase the women's movement, they think of Gloria and they rarely think of Betty these days.
I think of all three of them. I put them all together.
Put them together. Yeah. Yeah.
And someone else that we heard, who was the person that I never, you know, who was the other lady that we heard, the author that you said, come on.
Letty Cotton.
Cotton.
No, Letty
Yeah.
Sure. Yeah.
She spoke to us
Thank you.
last year.
She spoke to you. Yeah. Yeah. She has a new memoir out. Is that what she spoke about?
Yeah, she spoke about her book, Shonda.
Oh, cool.
Anyone else have Mark?
Yeah, this is timely and for me because I just read something on the Substack. The person I read, Liz Lenz, talking about marriage, and it kind of resonated with me when you said that the movement was not against marriage, and as in so many cases, when you just say that, you allow your opponents to define what marriage is. And you have recently the Washington Post saying that liberal women have to suck it up and marry conservative men because, and the studies that married people live longer, when really, if it's real true at all, it's about the men. But, how did she feel in later years? And I guess part of what you said is that her marriage made her feel insecure about attacking it. But I wonder if her views on marriage evolved and redefining marriage and, what marriage in our society should be.
Well, she came to, she apologized for the Lavender Menace in 1977, and she came to appreciate, I don't know, not gay marriage, but there could be families that could be unconventional families, right? And then that a family could mean something more than just a nuclear family, husband, wife, 2 children. So she evolved in her thinking about that. But again, I mean, this really came from a place of her interest in including men in the National Organization for Women and including men in feminism came from a place of not wanting to make, one half of the, population the enemy. Right. And rather she wanted men and women to work together to improve childcare laws and, fix reproductive rights and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. She really believed that could happen, but she didn't think it could happen if the women's movement alienated men. The people who were thought that men were the enemy were more initially Gloria, like a woman without a man is like a fish without a bicycle. You probably heard that slogan. And then Kate Millett, somebody who came younger. So, but I think it's also, it's also like it's a question of age too, because when Betty published The Feminine Mystique, she was already in her 40s and had 3 children. And like Gloria Steinem was single and, she didn't have any children. And like a lot of women in the movement. And I think your perspective about what you think feminism is, like what's important, changes, as you grow older.
It's I'm curious, what did you say in your article when you were writing about the article that kind of led you to this book in terms of comparing the feminine mystique to like to Lean In?
Well, Lean In was written by someone who is a corporate, at the top of the corporate pyramid. And Betty was not at the top of the corporate pyramid, right? And Lean In, right? Sheryl Sandberg's main argument is about, how women should be more strategic, right? Lean in, just be interested, right? Betty's argument was not about being interested. It was about, how women, first of all, how women had to live up to their full potential. But then second about how systems had to change. Betty was very interested in systems changing, laws changing. Sandberg is not interested in that. That the book doesn't really take that up. Right.
Yeah, I mean, how by the end of her life, how did Betty feel? How much did Betty feel like she had accomplished a lot, or did she feel like she really had only scratched the surface? I mean, I don't know. For me,
I think she felt like she had accomplished something in the 60s and 70s, but she worried about like the 80s, the 90s, when it really seemed, there were feminism stalled, right? And even Clinton disappointed her. She just felt that things had not legally, women had and socially women had not women had made enormous strides, yes, but there was still more to do, and she was just troubled by that.
Yeah, it's really interesting to me just listening to you speak about it, because I was born in 1972. So, and I just, and I think about, what you're saying. I actually am embarrassed to say I have not read The Feminine Mystique, but now I will, along with your book. But, I think, like, fundamentally, and I struggle with this, like, I want to help everybody. And also, Betty's message about, like, the core things that needed to change for women, like, those things have not really changed as much as they need to,
No.
really at all. And so the things that I struggle with, and my colleagues struggle with, and other women who are in the workforce with kids, it hasn't really changed that much. We just have more platforms to complain about it, or than women did before. And and I will say also, I just thought, it was really interesting to me, when, I guess you said this was kind of what spurred her to write The Feminine Mystique, but asking her classmates, what was the purpose of going to school? Like, when you think about the systemic changes that still need to be made for there to be equity between men and women, and, like, we can get all the education that we want, but then we've hit this, wall, and
Right.
and it's that much harder to,
Right.
the rungs between, the space between the rungs is much higher,
Yeah.
more distant.
The space between the ranks and also when the ERA did not ratify in 1982, Betty was really devastated, because she thought that if these rights were enshrined in the Constitution, then that would have been really a mark of progress, right? It would have meant something.
Yeah, and I'll just say, I mean, I know we're running out of time, but and I listened to what you're saying, and and in essence what Betty was saying, and I was ordained 20 years ago, and I can just say that within a few years, I immediately became involved in the Women's Rabbinic Network, which is like the Now for Women Rabbis, and now the Now for women rabbis and non-binary rabbis. But that being said, I would often go speak to new ordaintees or women who are about to be ordained as rabbis. I just thought, I'm post-feminist. Like, I don't need this stuff.
Right.
And I would think, and the colleagues that I'd be with, who are already out, would say, okay, call me in a year. Like, tell me if it's the same in a year.
Exactly.
Right.
Exactly.
And workforce. And, I go back to the issues that you listed that Betty was fighting for. And, all those things are still, at the core of what women are struggling for.
Right.
So it's like such an important book, and such an important way to remind people of what women really still need to be fighting for. And so for that reason and so many more, I'm so appreciative for you, to you for writing this book. So I want to be respectful of everyone's time and bring this to a close. I just want to remind people the book is called Betty Friedan, Magnificent Disruptor. And please, it's almost Hanukkah. It's a great Hanukkah gift for people, but also another way to also help get out the word about a great book with a very important message, especially maybe to the younger women and men, allies in your life, is write a review on Goodreads or write a review on Amazon, because that helps people know that this is a book worth reading. And it just helps spread the word. So Rachel Shteir, thank you so much. Your students at DePaul are lucky to have you on a regular basis, and we were very, very lucky to have you for this hour. So thank you so much.
Thank you. I really appreciate your interest. Thank you so much.
It was super it was a true pleasure. And friends, if you're there and you want to just show your faces for a second so that our professor can see that we're really here, that would be terrific. Thank you, everybody. Have a great night.
Thanks.